I'm going to be presenting on Walter Dean Meyer's novel Monster, specifically talking about race and the internalized self. So I begin with a research question: how does race function in Monster? Then I ask specifically, how does the American criminal justice system contribute to the impact of the internalized white gaze on the entire African American population psyche in Monster? So to begin to answer this question, I have a quote from page 79 that states, "Well, frankly, nothing is happening that speaks to your being innocent. Half of those jurors, no matter what they said when we questioned them when we picked the jury, believed you were guilty the moment they laid eyes on you. You're young, you're Black, and you're on trial. What else do they need to know?" I found this quote to be very important because it's stated early on in the novel before we get deep into the trial, and it's also a quote taken from his lawyer. What it implies is a shadow of predetermined discrimination present within the American criminal justice system. It also implies that Steve has to recognize early on that his innocence will not be determined solely on the actual evidence presented in the trial, but also by external factors that stem from a white perspective. I think this quote encompasses both the ideas of the white gaze and the internalized self. Throughout the novel is this implication of a white gaze that forces Steve to form this third identity. In an article by Tim Ingalls and Corey Fern titled "What Did She See? The White Gaze in Postmodern Triple Consciousness" in Walter Dean Meyer's Monster, there's a quote that states, "In both narrative modes, Steve defines and analyzes the prejudging, ontologically obliterating powers of the white gaze focused on a person of color. His screenplay and journal also provide demonstrations of Steve's understanding that to survive the effects of the judicial system's white gaze, he needs to fashion what amounts to a third mode of identity, an acceptably Black presentation of self." This quote is really important because the idea of this acceptably Black third identity not only attempts to shield Steve from the judicial system's white gaze, but also helps him form an identity and image of himself that opposes the stereotypical views of all African Americans. I think that the term acceptably Black is also really important because it implies that there's a difference between being just a normal human being, specifically an African American, and also what specifically in the lens of a white perspective, how an African American should act or behave. This kind of factors into the internalized self. Even 5 months after Steve is found innocent, he continues to struggle with his self-identity. He has three modes of identity, essentially his acceptably Black mode of identity, who he really is and who he's trying to figure out to be. In the article by Tim Ingalls and Corey Fern, again, they're titled "Incarceration, Identity Formation, and Race in Young Adult Literature, The Case of Monster versus Hold My Life." There's a quote that states, "Steve Harmon is increasingly aware that his racial status makes it difficult for others to see him as a individual human being." I think this is important because at the end of the novel, we learn that Steve films himself to find this identity separate from the white gaze, and also an identity that he himself can see as an individual human being, no matter what a white gaze or white perspective could see. Throughout the novel, Myers is specifically speaking for African Americans who are in a constant effort to formulate their identities separate from this white gaze. Moving on to the picture in the bottom right corner of the poster is a page found on 24. The page reads, "Steve is reading the word monster over and over again. A white hand takes the pencil from his hand and crosses out all of the monsters. You have to believe in yourself if we're going to convince a jury that we're innocent." I found this really important because in the dialogue, the noticeably mentioned white hand of O'Brien that reaches over to cross off the word monster, as well as offering Steve a guided thought, only perpetuates the influence of whites over Blacks. I believe Myers includes this simple yet effective page and description to further the displacement of African Americans, adding to an underlying notion of a superior white hand that is placed above them. Now, in conclusion, and in my actual research paper, I provide a concrete base for this argument with statistical data that formulates the novel's external environment surrounding the American criminal justice system, focusing on the comparison of incarcerated Black individuals to whites, which is 6 times more likely than white individuals. Walter Dean Myers uses the story of Steve Harmon in Monster to criticize the white community that has held their race superior to Blacks throughout history. The inequality between races stems from a white gaze that separates the identity of an individual into two parts, the acceptable Black and their true self. Thank you.